At 7:30 in the morning on the 9th of March 1945, in the headquarters building at North Field on the island of Guam, Major General Curtis LeMay sat at his desk and signed a single field order. He knew, as he signed it, that the operation it authorized would kill more people in one night than any air attack in the history of the world. He had commanded the 21st Bomber Command for exactly 41 days. In those 41 days, he had watched the doctrine he was handed fail completely. Now, he was about to throw out every rule the Air Force had taught him, and his signature was the only authorization the mission required. On the desk beside the order lay a projection written by his own staff. It warned that the new tactic might cost him a large part of his force on the very first night. He signed it anyway. Curtis LeMay was 38 years old, and he had already earned a reputation as the hardest-driving bomber commander in the American Air Force. His men called him Iron Ass, and they meant it as something between a curse and a compliment. He had built his name over Europe, often flying the lead aircraft himself, and inventing the tactics that got bombers onto their targets and their crews back alive. He did not give speeches. He chewed a cigar, said little, and expected results. And when he did not get them, he relieved the men responsible without ceremony. He had been sent out to the Pacific in January for exactly that reason, because the man before him had not delivered. His predecessor had run the campaign by the book, the high-altitude daylight precision doctrine taught in the Air Force schools. And the book had failed against Japan. LeMay was brought in to make the B-29 work by whatever means it took. He had 41 days to study the failure before he chose the means. And the means he settled on were the ones no one else had dared to order. Before the next sunrise, 16 square miles of Tokyo would be reduced to ash, and something close to 100,000 people would be dead. It happened for one reason. An American commander had decided that the only way left to win the war was to burn a city to the ground. For 4 months, the American bombing of Japan had been a failure, and everyone at the top of the Air Force knew it. The B-29 superfortress had been built to bomb from 30,000 ft in daylight, striking precise industrial targets. It was the most expensive weapons program of the entire war, costing around $3 billion, more than the atomic bomb project itself. And it was not working. Over Japan, the bombers ran into a problem no one had planned for. A river of air, later called the jet stream, tore across the home islands at speeds near 200 mph, flinging bombs miles away from their targets. Cloud covered the cities 7 days out of 10. The great Nakajima aircraft plant at Musashino had been attacked again and again across many missions, and it still stood almost untouched. General Henry Arnold, who commanded the whole Air Force from Washington, wanted results, and he wanted them immediately. The failure was not for any lack of courage or effort. The B-29 was the most advanced aircraft of the war, and also one of the most troublesome. Its great engines ran hot and caught fire with terrible frequency, and the long climb to 30,000 ft with a full load of bombs and fuel pushed them to the edge of destruction. Crews were lost to engine fires and mechanical failure without ever laying eyes on an enemy fighter. And when they did reach the target, the air itself defeated them. The jet stream was a thing almost no one had encountered before, a band of wind so fast it could rival the speed of the bombers. And it simply carried the falling bombs away into empty countryside. America was spending the costliest weapon of the war and the lives of superb crews to blow craters in open fields. And behind the failure loomed something far worse than a wasted bombing campaign. If air power could not break Japan, then the only way left to end the war was to invade the home islands. and the plans for that invasion projected a bloodbath without precedent in American history. But the decision to burn Tokyo does not begin over the Sumida River on the night of the fire. It begins months earlier, in the collapse of everything the American Air Force believed about how to win, and in a stretch of desert in Utah where the burning of this exact city had already been rehearsed. To understand the decision, you have to understand the city it was aimed at. Tokyo in 1945 was the most crowded place on the face of the earth. In the eastern wards along the Sumida River in districts such as Asakusa, Onjo, Fukagawa, and Koto, people lived packed together at a density that passed 100,000 human beings for every square mile. Nothing else on the planet came close to it, and almost all of it was built of wood and paper. These were the old working neighborhoods, two-story wooden houses pressed wall to wall along streets too narrow for a fire engine to turn. In the dry, windy days of early March, the whole district was, in plain terms, kindling laid out across the ground and waiting for a spark. The Americans already had good reason to believe it would burn. Late in February, a force of well over 100 bombers had made a daylight attack on Tokyo with incendiaries and had burned out a substantial patch of the city. That had not been the first such test, either. Earlier in the month, American bombers had struck the port of Kobe with firebombs, and the results there had encouraged the planners as well. Piece by piece, the Air Force was learning that fire was the key to Japan in a way that high explosive would never be, and that the wooden cities would take the flame and spread it on their own. The choice of exactly where to burn was not left to chance. American analysts had studied Tokyo ward by ward, ranking each district by how readily it would catch and carry fire. They weighed the density of the buildings, the materials they were made of, and how tightly they were packed. And they had even made use of fire risk assessments drawn up by Japanese insurance companies before the war. The eastern wards along the Sumida came out at the top of every list. On paper, they were the most flammable large piece of city anywhere on Earth. It is worth stopping on what that ranking actually meant. The most flammable district in the world was also a place where 750,000 people lived and slept and raised their children. To the planners, it was a fire problem to be solved, ranked and mapped, and scored like any other target. To the people who lived there, it was simply home, the most crowded and the most vulnerable home on Earth. And neither they nor the men mapping them from across the ocean yet grasped how completely the two facts would meet on the night of the 10th of March. Tokyo knew fire in its bones. The city had burned once before in the Great Earthquake of 1923, when firestorms killed tens of thousands of people in a single afternoon. But the defenses built after that catastrophe were built for earthquakes. The evacuation plans pushed people out of their homes and into open ground, into schoolyards and parks and public gardens, away from the buildings that might collapse and crush them. That instinct was about to prove fatal because the thing coming for the city in 1945 was not an earthquake. It was a fire that would move faster than a human being could run. The parallel to 1923 was closer than anyone wished to think. In that earthquake, the worst killing had not come from collapsing buildings at all. It had come from fire and, above all, from a single monstrous whirlwind of flame that swept across an open ground where thousands of people had gathered to escape and killed almost all of them in minutes. The lesson had been there for more than 20 years, written into the city's own memory. Open ground was no protection against a great fire. But the plans still sent people into the open, because open ground was the right protection against the danger the plans had been written to fear, which was the falling building, and not the bomb. Curtis LeMay looked at the failure of the last 4 months and made a decision that reversed all of it. He would strip the guns off the bombers, every position except the tail, and pull out the gunners and their ammunition to save the weight. He would load each aircraft with 6 tons of incendiary bombs in place of high explosive. He would send the bombers in at night, one at a time instead of in formation. And he would bring them in low, between 5,000 and 9,000 ft, far beneath the altitude the doctrine demanded. Every part of that was heresy. The B-29 had been built to fight high, in daylight, in tight formations that pulled their defensive guns. LeMay was proposing to send it in stripped bare, alone, and low over the most heavily defended enemy capital on Earth. His own intelligence staff ran the numbers and warned him that the enemy might destroy a large share of his force in a single pass of the war's worst luck. There was a cold logic underneath the apparent madness of it, and LeMay had worked it through carefully. Flying low meant the engines did not have to make the long punishing climb to 30,000 ft, which saved fuel and spared the machines that had been failing so often. It meant each bomber could carry far more fire and far less gasoline. And the altitude he chose sat in a gap in the enemy's defenses, too high for the light guns to reach well, and too low for the heavy guns set for the daylight raids. The plan looked insane on its surface. Underneath it was the work of a commander who had studied exactly where the enemy was strong and had chosen to strike precisely where the enemy was not. He made the call, and he made it almost entirely on his own authority. He did not ask General Arnold for permission. He briefed one of Arnold's deputies, then sent the plan forward on a day he knew his superiors in Washington would be away. And he admitted later that he had done it partly, so the blame would fall on him alone if the raid failed. LeMay could not even fly the mission to share the danger with his crews. He had been briefed on the secret of the atomic bomb, and a man who carried that secret could not be risked over enemy territory. LeMay believed he had no better choice, and the case he was making to himself was a serious one. It begins with the plain fact that precision bombing simply did not work over Japan. 4 months of trying had proven that beyond argument. The wind and the cloud and the sheer distance beat the bomb site on nearly every mission, and the factories the Air Force had crossed the Pacific to destroy were still turning out weapons. Then there was the nature of the target itself, and this is the argument that mattered most. Japanese war industry was not gathered into a handful of great plants that a precise strike could knock out. It was scattered deliberately, and by the thousands straight into the neighborhoods. Small workshops inside ordinary wooden houses turned out parts and pieces that fed the larger factories. And those workshops sat in the middle of the residential districts. American planners concluded, coldly and not without reason, that the war economy could not be destroyed without burning the district that housed it. The homes and the war machine had become the same target, and behind all of it stood the invasion. If bombing could not force Japan to surrender, then American soldiers would have to land on the home islands in an operation the planners named Downfall. The projections for that invasion were staggering. American casualties were estimated anywhere from 250,000 men to well over 1 million. Japanese dead, soldiers and civilians together, would have run into the millions in a nation that was already arming its ordinary people to resist with whatever they could pick up. To LeMay and to Arnold, the fire was not weighed against nothing. It was weighed against that, and against the certainty that the war would grind on and on, until something finally broke it. The strategic picture in early 1945 made all of this press even harder on the men who had to decide. Japan had plainly lost the war in any rational sense. Its navy was shattered. Its merchant fleet was being sunk faster than it could be replaced, and its cities lay open to attack from the air. And yet, Japan showed no sign whatever of surrendering. Its soldiers fought to the death on island after island. Its pilots crashed their aircraft into American ships on purpose. And its government spoke of the whole nation dying before it would accept defeat. To the American command, an enemy that would not quit even when beaten was an enemy that would have to be forced to quit. And the only tools that might do the forcing were fire. And though almost no one yet knew it, a bomb. On the far side of the ocean, the men responsible for defending Tokyo had prepared with great care for the wrong war. Japanese air defense was built around the pattern the Americans had shown for 4 months. Attacks at high altitude in daylight aimed at industrial targets. The fighters were positioned to climb to great height and meet the bombers in the sun. The heavy anti-aircraft guns were set for 30,000 ft. The defenses for a night attack were almost an afterthought. For the entire region around the capital, the Japanese had roughly 20 night fighters that could operate in darkness. A small force of twin-engine machines held back at a base outside the city. 20 aircraft to defend the largest city in the empire against whatever might come after the sun went down. Those few night fighters were the whole of the capital's after-dark defense in the air, flown by a naval air group from a base on the edge of the Tokyo plain. The guns on the ground were no better matched to what was coming. The heavy anti-aircraft batteries had been sighted and calibrated to reach bombers at 30,000 ft. An aircraft crossing the city at 6,000 or 7,000 ft was in some ways too low for those guns to engage well, and the lighter weapons that could reach that height were far too few to matter against a stream of hundreds of bombers. The defense had been built gun by gun and fighter by fighter for an enemy that flew high in the daylight. It had almost nothing to say to an enemy that came in low and in the dark. The general responsible for the ground defense of the capital was Lieutenant General Shizuichi Tanaka, who commanded the Eastern District Army. Tanaka was a professional soldier with decades of service behind him. And he understood better than anyone how thin his resources were. He had firefighters and equipment sized for ordinary fires, water mains that were old and weak, and shelters dug against earthquakes. He had prepared, in short, as well as his means allowed for the threat that had been arriving for 4 months. He had not prepared, because he simply could not, for the threat that was about to arrive in its place. The Americans, for their part, had done their homework on how to burn Tokyo, and they had done it with a thoroughness that is chilling to look back on. Out in the Utah desert, at a place called Dugway Proving Ground, the army had built a full replica of a Japanese working-class neighborhood. They brought in set designers from Hollywood to get the details right, using authentic construction, wooden frames and tile roofs, and thin paper walls. Then they burned it down, again and again, testing which bombs and which patterns and which altitudes would make it burn best. They did not do it once. They burned the replica down and rebuilt it, and burned it again, over and over, across months of trials, refining the mixture and the fusing, and the way the bomblets scattered, until they had something that would set a Japanese neighborhood alight with near certainty. It was, in effect, a laboratory for the destruction of a city, run in the American desert 2 years before the real city was ever touched. By the time the order came for the actual raid, the Americans knew, with the confidence of repeated experiment, more or less exactly how Tokyo would burn. The weapon that came out of those tests was the M69, a small incendiary bomb lit filled with napalm, and dropped in clusters that scattered dozens of them across a neighborhood at once. Each little bomb punched through a roof, ignited on the floor below, and threw out a spray of burning jelly that stuck to whatever it touched, and could not be beaten out. 500,000 of them were loaded into the bombers for the night of the 9th of March. When the crews filed into the briefing rooms on Guam and Saipan and Tinian that afternoon, and the maps were finally uncovered, many of them could not believe what they were hearing. They were used to flying at 30,000 ft in daylight, in formations that pooled the fire of hundreds of guns. Now they were being told to go in at night, alone, at 5,000 to 9,000 ft over the enemy capital, with their guns and their gunners stripped out to make room for more firebombs. One after another, the obvious fear went around the rooms. Without the guns and without the formation, what was to stop the Japanese night fighters from picking them off, one by one, in the dark? The answer they were given was simple, and as it turned out it was correct. Japanese night fighter strength was tiny, and their low-altitude anti-aircraft fire was far weaker than the guns set for high altitude. Speed and darkness and surprise would be the bombers' armor now in place of the guns that had been thrown away. The men did not have to like it. They only had to fly it. The plan called for a handful of Pathfinder aircraft to fly in first and mark the target. They would lay their firebombs in a giant flaming X across the eastern wards, and the main force coming in behind them would simply aim at the burning cross and the fires it started. The commander who would lead the mission over the target was Brigadier General Thomas Power. Since LeMay himself was grounded on Guam, and the whole design depended on the low individual night approach that the doctrine had always forbidden. Late in the afternoon of the 9th, the bombers began to roll. They lifted off from the captured islands of Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. More than 300 of them from 3 separate wings, each one heavy with 6 tons of fire, and the fuel for a round trip of some 3,000 mi. They did not gather into formation over the ocean as they always had before. Each aircraft climbed out alone and turned northwest into the darkness, strung across hundreds of miles of empty sea. A loose river of single bombers all flowing toward the same city. It was the largest and strangest strike the command had ever launched, and every crew in it was committed to an approach that violated everything they had been trained to believe. The flight itself was long and lonely and frightening in a new way. For some 7 hours, each aircraft droned northwest across open ocean, alone in the dark, with no formation around it and almost no guns aboard, toward a city that everyone expected to be a wall of searchlights and flak. The men who had flown the high daylight raids had at least had the company of the formation and the comfort of their guns. These crews had neither. They had only speed and darkness, and the hope that the planners were right about how weak the night defenses truly were. It began exactly as had been drawn up. As the scattered bombers crossed the Japanese coast, radar picked them up, but the operators read the loose, low, single-file contacts as a reconnaissance flight, rather than a raid, because no raid had ever looked anything like this. By the time the command grasped what was truly happening, and ordered the night fighters into the air, the Pathfinders were already over the city. The fighters climbed too late, and shot down nothing at all. The most heavily defended capital in the enemy empire was, on this one night, very nearly defenseless against precisely the thing that was coming for it. At around midnight on the 10th of March, the first Pathfinder reached its release point above the Sumida River, and the flaming X was laid across the wards below. Behind it, the main force came on in a long stream, aircraft after aircraft, each one dropping its 6 tons and turning away. A fresh load of fire arriving every 40 seconds or so. The separate fires did exactly what the tests in the desert had promised they would. They caught. They spread. They reached toward one another, and they began to merge, and then the wind that the forecasters had counted on took hold. A hard, dry wind was blowing across the city that night, and it drove the flames from block to block, far faster than anyone on the ground could react. The bombers coming in behind the first waves flew straight into what the fire was making. The rising heat threw up columns of superheated air, thousands of feet into the night sky, and the aircraft passing overhead were tossed and lifted by the updrafts. Thrown against their harnesses, some of them shoved hundreds of feet higher in the smell of burning wood reached the crews inside their sealed cabins, high above the city. They were flying over the largest fire that human beings had ever deliberately made, and they could feel it come up through the controls. Within an hour, the scattered fires had joined into a single burning mass, and that mass began to generate its own weather. The heat sucked air in along the ground and hurled it upward, and the inrushing wind fed the flames and drove the gusts at street level past 50 and then 60 mph. This was no longer a large fire. It was a firestorm, a self-feeding wall of flame miles across, and once it closed upon itself, there was nothing any firefighter alive could have done to halt it. That is where the first half of this story ends, with the most crowded city on Earth beginning to burn as one. It took 8 hours to get every name and number in this story right, because this is the deadliest night of aerial warfare that has ever happened, and it deserves to be told with the facts straight and nothing invented. If this is the history you want more of, hit like. 1 like. Nothing more. Thank you. The people of the Eastern Wards did almost exactly what they had been trained to do, and it killed them. The evacuation plans written for earthquakes told them to leave their wooden houses and gather in the open, in schoolyards and parks and public gardens, where no falling building could reach them. So, they went. Thousands of families walked out of their homes and into the assembly points, and waited there in the open ground as the whole sky turned orange above them. But the danger that night was not a collapsing building. It was the fire itself, and the fire came into those open spaces and did not stop at their edges. The heat arrived before the flames did, a radiant pressure that made the air unbreathable and the ground too hot to stand on. The streets that led away had already become corridors of fire. In the parks and the schoolyards where families had gathered for their safety, there was suddenly nowhere left to run, and many died where they stood. In the very ground the plan had promised would protect them. The scale of it at individual places is almost beyond belief. At one public garden in the Eastern Wards, thousands of people had crowded in among the paths and around the ornamental pond, trusting that the open space and the water would save them. The fire reached the garden and did not spare it, and the pond itself is said to have boiled. At a primary school where some 2,000 people had gathered in the courtyard, following the evacuation plan to the letter, the fire took nearly all of them, though no building there had fallen. The safe places, chosen with such care by a city that remembered its last great fire, filled instead with the dead. The heat at the center of the firestorm reached levels that are hard to put into ordinary words. Temperatures at street level climbed toward 1900. Hot enough that the asphalt of the roads softened and then caught. Hot enough that in the strongest concrete buildings, the window glass ran down the walls in streams. Survivors who lived through it described a wind of fire, a roaring gale pulled inward by the flames, strong enough to knock people from their feet and drag loose objects into the blaze. This was not a fire that could be escaped by ordinary means. It had made its own hurricane, and it was pulling the district into itself. Others ran for the water. They crowded onto the bridges over the Sumida and down its banks, and into the canals that laced the district, trying to escape the unbearable heat. In some places, the press of bodies was so great that people drowned in shallow water. And in the narrowest canals the water grew scalding as the fire closed around it. One bridge over the river, packed with people fleeing in both directions at once, became a place of mass death. By the time the night was over, the river and the canals had become part of the city's grief rather than its refuge. At his headquarters at Ichigaya, 2 miles west of the burning, General Tanaka received the reports as they came in, and they grew worse by the hour. His firefighters were being overwhelmed and then simply swallowed. The telephone lines into the eastern wards burned through, so that whole districts fell silent all at once. The water pressure in the mains dropped toward zero as the pipes were severed in hundreds of places. Somewhere in the reporting, a word appeared that the Japanese used for what they were seeing, a term that meant a whirlwind of fire. Tanaka telephoned the residence of the Prime Minister, Kuniaki Koiso, and told him the truth in a handful of words. The eastern wards were burning. The fire could not be contained, and the dead were already beyond any hope of counting. There was nothing left to be done. The general who commanded the defense of the capital could only stand at his window and watch the eastern sky glow and smell the smoke through the closed glass. Tanaka was trying to command a battle he could not see. The reports that reached him were fragments carried by runners on bicycles once the telephones failed, and many of those runners never arrived. He ordered firefighting equipment shifted from the western wards toward the fire, and only a fraction of the orders got through, because the network that would have carried them was already burning. 2 miles from the flames at the very center of the empire's capital, the machinery of command had gone deaf and blind. There was, in the end, nothing for a general to command. The fire was answering to no one. The air defense fared no better than the fire brigades. The handful of night fighters that finally clawed into the sky came up long after the pathfinders had marked the city, and they found themselves hunting single bombers scattered across a front many miles wide in the dark above a glare of fire that ruined the eye. They brought down nothing. The heavy guns hammered away at an enemy flying below their best reach. For all the care that had gone into it across the years, the defense of the capital on the one night it was truly tested might as well not have existed at all. Hit subscribe right now, because coming up is the morning after, the true count of the dead, and the hardest question of the entire Pacific War, whether any of this had to happen at all. Do not go anywhere. By that point, the fire had made every order meaningless, because the fire itself had become a physical barrier. Army units sent in to help could not reach the burning wards. Bridges warped and buckled in the heat until no vehicle could cross them, and the surface of the road softened underfoot. Whatever the generals commanded, the fire decided what was possible, and the fire allowed almost nothing at all. Above the city, the bombers kept coming until nearly 3:30 in the morning. More than 3 hours of fire falling onto the same clustered wards. The last crews no longer needed the Pathfinder's marker to find the target. They could see Tokyo burning from more than 100 miles out, a glow spreading along the horizon, and some of them said afterward that they could read the instruments in their cockpits by the light of the city coming up through the open bomb bay. And then the disaster LeMay had feared for his own men did not come. He had been told he might lose a great part of his force in one night. He lost 14 bombers out of more than 300, a small fraction of the grim projection on his desk. The tactic that had broken every rule in the book had worked in the brutal and narrow sense that it destroyed the target and brought very nearly all of the crews safely home. By the middle of the next day, the photographs were on LeMay's desk on Guam. Reconnaissance aircraft had flown over the city and brought back images of the burn, mile after mile of grey ash, where the great wooden wards had stood the morning before. LeMay studied them, And his response was not doubt. It was to order the operation repeated. From Washington, General Arnold sent a message of congratulation, telling LeMay that the raid showed his crews had the guts for anything. Both men regarded the night as a complete success, because by the only measure they had been given, the destruction of the enemy's capacity to make war, it was won. When dawn broke on the 10th of March, 16 square miles of the city had ceased to exist. Where the densest neighborhoods on Earth had stood the evening before, there were now corridors of ash and the blackened frames of the few concrete buildings that had survived. The final counts put together in the months and years afterward are almost impossible to hold in the mind. Somewhere around 100,000 people were dead. More than 1 million had been left with no home at all. Close to a quarter of the entire city had burned away in a single night. The numbers that were eventually assembled only sharpened the horror rather than soften it. More than 250,000 buildings were gone. A quarter of all the housing in the city had been destroyed in a matter of hours. Rescue workers pulled tens of thousands of bodies from the ash and the canals in the days that followed. The official American survey later put the dead near 90,000 and the injured at some 40,000. Many who studied it believed the true toll ran well past 100,000. No one will ever have an exact count, because the fire had destroyed the very means of counting. The Japanese government did not tell its own people what had truly happened. The official announcement said only that American bombers had made a scattered raid on the capital and had been driven off with 15 of them shot down. It said nothing of the 16 square miles that were gone, and it said nothing of the dead. The people of Japan were told their capital had been defended. The real accounting was locked away inside classified reports that the public would not see for years. In the burned wards themselves, there was for a time only silence. Where the most crowded streets on Earth had roared with life the day before, there was ash to the horizon, the stumps of telegraph poles, and the odd concrete shell standing alone. Survivors moved through it, searching for their families among the dead, and the living carried what few things had come through the fire: a bent pair of eyeglasses, a scorched pot, a single photograph. The eastern wards, which had held more people in each square mile than anywhere on the planet, had in one night been emptied of almost everything that had made them a place where people lived. For the Americans, the raid was not an ending, but a template. LeMay studied the photographs and the loss rate, and ordered the same thing done again and again. In the days that immediately followed, the fire came to Nagoya, to Osaka, and to Kobe. Over the months that followed, it came to 67 Japanese cities in all. By the end of the war, something like 40% of the built-up area of urban Japan had been burned out. Tokyo was only the first of them, and it remained the worst single night of the entire campaign. The men who flew it carried it home in their aircraft in the most literal way. Crews reported the smell of burning wood, and worse, drawn up into the bomb bays as they passed through the smoke, a stench that clung to the airplanes after they had landed. Some of the men were sick in their cockpits. They had done what they were ordered to do and done it well. And many of them understood even then that they had taken part in something that would never quite let them go. Whatever the strategists concluded on paper, the men who had actually been over the fire knew what they had seen. The fire did not win the war by itself, and it is worth being clear about that. Over the next 5 months, the incendiary campaign burned the heart out of urban Japan. The naval blockade slowly choked the islands off from the food and oil they needed to live. And in August, 2 atomic bombs and the sudden entry of the Soviet Union into the war arrived, almost together. It was the weight of all of it at once that finally forced the surrender. But the firebombing was the part that came first and struck hardest at the cities. And Tokyo was the night that proved it could be done at all. This is the point where the hardest question has to be faced honestly, because people have argued over it ever since that night. Was it necessary? The men who ordered it believed, for real and serious reasons, that it was. Their argument ran roughly like this. Precision bombing had been given 4 full months and had failed, and the war could not be allowed to drag on for years while Japan went on producing weapons and killing Allied soldiers and prisoners by the day. Japan's war production was woven directly into the wooden neighborhoods, so that the industry could not be reached without those neighborhoods burning along with it. And the only alternative anyone at the top could see to breaking Japan from the air was to break it by invasion instead. That invasion, Operation Downfall, was expected to be the bloodiest undertaking in the history of the American military. The estimates of American casualties ran from perhaps 250,000 men up to more than 1 million. Japanese losses, military and civilian alike, would have reached into the millions. In a country that was already training every civilian it had to resist to the very end with sharpened bamboo, if nothing else remained. Weighed against that, the men who made the decision concluded that burning the cities, as terrible as it plainly was, would end the war sooner and at a smaller total cost in human life than a landing on the home islands ever could. And months later, the war did in fact end without that invasion ever having to be launched. And by their own measure, the fire did the work it was meant to do. The raids gutted Japanese production, drove the workers of the war factories from their homes, and threw the country's whole war economy into chaos in a way that 4 months of precision bombing never had. The advocates of air power had spent $3 billion and a great many lives to prove that bombers could be decisive. And in the burning of the Japanese cities, they believed they finally had their proof. Whether that proof was worth its price is exactly the question that has never been settled. That is not the only way to see it, though. And honesty requires setting down the other side with equal clarity. What happened at Tokyo was the deliberate burning to death of about 100,000 people. The overwhelming majority of them civilians, with women and children, and the old among the dead. Some historians argue that the deeper motive was to prove that the enormously expensive B-29 and the independent Air Force behind it could win a war largely on their own. Others argue that Japan was already being slowly strangled by the naval blockade and stood closer to collapse than the firebombing's defenders like to admit. Even the man who gave the order understood exactly how it looked. Curtis LeMay said plainly years afterward that if the United States had lost the war, he fully expected he would have been prosecuted as a war criminal. He believed the cause was just and the necessity real. And at the same time, he never once pretended the act was anything softer than what it was. He described what the fire had done to the people of Tokyo in words as blunt as the bombs themselves, saying that they had been scorched and boiled and baked to death. The debate has never gone quiet. The firebombing of Tokyo is set alongside the burning of Dresden in Germany a few weeks earlier, as one of the events that made people ask then and ever since whether the deliberate burning of enemy cities could be justified at all. It was never charged as a crime after the war, because the victors do not indict themselves. And LeMay understood that as well as anyone. The uncomfortable truth is that the very same act is remembered as necessary in large part because the side that ordered it won. Had it lost, the histories would read very differently. And the men who planned the fire grasped that more clearly than many of their later critics do. LeMay himself never wavered. He went on to build and command the force of nuclear bombers that stood ready through the Cold War. And to the end of his life, he defended what he had done over Japan as the grim arithmetic of a soldier's trade. Killing the enemy had not troubled him, he once said, because to let it trouble you was to be of no use as a soldier. And all war, in his view, was immoral to begin with. It is a hard creed, and in its way an honest one, and it belongs in the record beside the ashes. The man who burned the cities did not hide from what he had done. He simply believed the alternative would have been worse, and he said so until the day he died. So, the question does not resolve into a clean and comfortable answer, and this channel is not going to pretend that it does. What can be said is this: the men who made the decision were not monsters reveling in slaughter. They were commanders trying to end the deadliest war in human history at the lowest total cost in lives they could find. And they were convinced, on real and weighty evidence, that every alternative in front of them was worse. The fire over Tokyo was a horror. It may also have been the horror that prevented a far greater one. Both of those things can be true at the same time, and the honest verdict is that they very probably are. Here is how it unfolded, in order. August 1943, in the Utah desert. The army builds and repeatedly burns a full replica of a Japanese neighborhood to perfect the coming incendiary attack. January 1945. Curtis LeMay takes command and watches 4 months of precision bombing fail over Japan. 9th of March morning, on Guam. LeMay signs the field order for a low-altitude night incendiary raid on Tokyo. 10th of March, after midnight. The Pathfinders mark the flaming X, and a firestorm consumes the eastern wards of the city. Dawn. 10th of March, 16 square miles are gone, and roughly 100,000 people are dead. The months that follow, 67 Japanese cities burn, and in August, the war ends without the invasion ever being launched. The factors that made that night what it became are worth naming plainly. The first factor was the decision. Curtis LeMay's reversal of American doctrine, stripping the guns and going in low and at night with fire, was a genuine act of command taken on his own authority and against everything he had been taught. Without it, the raid does not happen. The second factor was a target built to burn. The eastern wards were the densest human settlement on Earth, made of wood and paper with the war industry scattered all through the homes. No city was ever more perfectly suited to destruction by fire, and the American planners knew it. The third factor was a defense made for the wrong war. Japan had prepared rationally and thoroughly for high-altitude daylight precision raids, and it had almost nothing ready for a low attack in the dark. The defense was excellent, and it answered a question the Americans had stopped asking. The fourth factor was the invasion it was meant to prevent. The fire cannot be understood apart from the alternative that hung over every commander who ordered it. The landing on the home islands that promised to kill many times more people than the flames ever did. Strip away the maps and the casualty counts, and the burning of Tokyo comes down to a single reversal worth stating plainly. The enemy had built a careful, rational, complete defense against the war it expected. Then, in one night, the Americans changed the war. The daylight precision battle of the previous 4 months was the one Japan was ready to fight. And after midnight on the 10th of March, every part of that defense was left answering a question no one was asking anymore. And there is a smaller and crueler reversal folded inside the first. The places the city had set aside as safe, the open grounds where the people were sent to escape a collapsing city, were the very places where the greatest numbers of them died. The plan built to save lives delivered them into the fire. General Shizuichi Tanaka lived to see the war end. In its final days, he helped put down an attempt by a group of army officers to seize the palace and stop the emperor's surrender broadcast, standing against the revolt in order to let the war finally close. And then, only days after the surrender, having commanded the defense of a capital that had burned to ash under his watch, he took his own life. He left behind letters that dealt only with personal matters, and none that explained the choice. And those who knew him understood it as a soldier's accounting for what had happened on the ground he was charged to protect. There is something worth pausing on in the manner of his end. On the night before the surrender broadcast, a band of fanatical officers tried to seize the palace and keep the war going. It was Tanaka who went in person into the palace grounds, faced them down, and ordered them to stand down. Because of that, the emperor's decision to end the war was carried out as planned. He spent nearly the last act of his life stopping men who wanted to prolong the fighting. And then, the accounting done and the war over, he chose not to survive it. He was buried under a plain marker that gives only his name, his rank, and the dates of his life. In Sumida Ward today, there stands a memorial hall. It was built first for the dead of the 1923 earthquake, and after the war it was given a second and heavier duty to hold the ashes of the unidentified dead of the fire. Inside, the remains of the two disasters can no longer be told apart. The ash of the earthquake and the ash of the firebombing mingled together beyond separating. And the hall simply holds them and records what happened without assigning blame to anyone. On its wall, an inscription gives only the date and the number of the dead. It does not justify the raid, and it does not condemn it. It states what was done, and it leaves the judgment to the living. For a long time, the wider world barely remembered it. The atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became the images of Japan's agony. And the night that killed as many people as either of them slipped toward the edge of memory, even in Japan. It was the survivors themselves who kept it alive. They gathered the diaries and the photographs and the small objects that were left behind. And some of them built their own museums to hold the memory, when the state would not. They insisted that a raid which killed 100,000 people in a few hours not be allowed to vanish, simply because it had been done with ordinary fire rather than a single terrible bomb. To this day, the 10th of March is marked quietly in Tokyo each year, an anniversary for the deadliest night the air war ever produced. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because every week we tell you how America actually won its war, the hard decisions and the terrible ones included, without flattering the past and without flinching from it either. Hit subscribe, then like, and tell us in the comments where you come down on the hardest question of the Pacific War. We will see you in the next one.